So the starting point is this particular discussion that is happening across the continent, Agenda 2063. And so a few years ago, the African Union, which is the body that represents all 54 states in Africa, felt that it was important to take stock of what we've achieved 50 years after global independence. And of course, the track record is abysmal. It's really, really worrying. And the idea was to begin to think about the future, to think Africa into the 21st century. And we say 100 years after colonialism, what is the Africa that we can imagine? And a discussion document was produced, Agenda 2063, and this is meant to be the narrative that is helping Africans to have a conversation about this transition. What was very significant about the vision statement of this was an explicit acknowledgement and focus on cities. Now, why this is significant is that within the African narrative and within the development discourse in Africa, we've always had an enormous difficulty to acknowledge and to embrace urbanization. And the reason for this is that a lot of the national ideologies that have been accompanying the liberation movement and the liberation parties that tend to still be in government has been one where nationalism, African nationalism, was equated with a return to the land, a valorization of land politics, and a profoundly agricultural and traditional vision of liberation, freedom, and so forth. And so the urban is always represented at a very deep psychic level for African leaders, the realm of vice, of dysfunction, of the expression of European colonialism and cultural imperialism. And so it is not something that you've ever embraced willingly or with an open mind. And so the fact that this narrative actively understood that cities is in fact part of Africa's future and that we should think of it in practical terms was very, very significant. And so we use that as a reference point to make this argument that in fact we are beginning to think about the idea of an Africa that is confident, about an Africa that can, in a way, act in the face of history and can project for itself a rather subaltern and subversive disposition. And this is related in the narrative that we built to a couple of things coming together. One is Africa will have the largest labor force by 2040 in the world. And this is because of the demographic structure and how that is changing over the next 50 years. That connected with the data from The Economist that mobile internet access will dramatically increase over the next decade, and we're looking at levels of 75% penetration by 2025. I think that number is a bit optimistic, but even if it's 2050, that's still very, very significant. And the confluence of these two dynamics we think is really important, and of course, no other than Zuckerberg was, sort of eating local food and checking out local clubs and music in Lagos and in Nairobi just a month ago. But the argument that we make in the piece is that unless this, if you will, sources of confidence is connected to the emergence of a new kind of leadership, that opportunity won't be realized. And so leadership is about competence, obviously, but very importantly in the African context, because you've got relatively weak states. You've got a distribution of power to multiple sources, including still, very importantly, traditional authorities. You have to think about leadership in a profoundly distributed form. So the traditional ways in which we think about elite compacts that set visions and is able to sustain transitions is not a viable option. It doesn't really apply because of the way in which both the economy and the polity operates. And so really thinking through the idea of distributed forms of leadership is key. But also to build into the national frames that will obviously guide these processes a commitment to transparency and supporting distributed methods of leadership across society and across levels of society. Now, the next piece of the narrative then moves to the idea of opportunity and how do we think about opportunity in a prioritized form because of the scale of the need is so different. So of course, we know, and I've already referenced the Agenda 2063 and the kind of thinking in there is absolutely consistent with the emergence of the new set of discursive parameters through the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and the new agenda. And the connecting point that brings these two things together is a very African-specific discourse at the moment around the idea of structural transformation. And what this is dealing with, it's trying to understand why it is that we don't see a relationship between increased urbanization and economic diversification. So there's a disconnect between economic development and urbanization. So the Economic Commission of Africa has been grappling with this question and trying to think and define what structural transformation is. Now, of course, in the context of globalization, and where cities are the spatial anchors of the global economy, this is great news for us. This, in fact, is making the case for cities in the context of urbanization. So next year, the report, as I've just said to Anu a second ago, is in fact going to focus explicitly on urbanization and structural transformation, the 2017 report. Why that is absolutely fantastic news for sort of the urban community in Africa is that the ECA reports to the Ministers of Finance, and that report will be presented to the African Ministers of Finance, some of between March and June. Now, what it's trying to grapple with is if you look at the post-colonial era, from 1961 until a couple of years ago, you will see that we have never been able to grow the share of manufacturing jobs across the country. This is despite the dramatic demographic shift that we are seeing and the emergence of this role that I referenced earlier to. And if we're not able to arrest that, we are in very, very, very deep trouble as urbanization goes from 40 to 60%. Another way then of thinking about that is how do we engage with that using this particular definition of the ECA in terms of what structural transformation means. And of course, as C references there, the rise of a modern industrial and service economy is a really key part of the puzzle to convince some of the key policymakers about the importance of explicit urbanization. Now, another key report that was really useful for the urban agenda in Africa has been a report co-published by the OECD, the African Development and UNDP earlier this year, called the Africa Economic Outlook. And the theme for this year was sustainable urbanization. And my center worked with them on this report. And one of the useful things about this report is this typology that they produced to try and understand the enormous variation across the 54 states. So what you will see is we've got 5 categories, and we try and understand the extent of urbanization, what is happening with fertility transitions, how that is related to gross national income per capita, and then where these countries score on the Human Development Index. And that's how we've been able to categorize the 54 countries. And as you can see, there's only 5 out of the 54 countries that fall in this category of diversified. Only 5. That includes South Africa, Cairo. And what's important about that is that if you look at the early urbanizers and the later urbanizers, you still sit with very high fertility. And this is our big challenge, that our fertility, both in rural and urban areas, is not right. And so, of course, the pressure that this puts on national governments to provide basic services, to deal with education, etc., is enormous and remains intense. And the challenge is to attend to that in a context of very, very high levels of income poverty. And it's not just that we've got high levels of income poverty, so it means your tax base is very small. It's also that we sit with a highly informalized economy, so a lot of the income that does circulate doesn't get caught in the tax system. And so we've got really, really minuscule fiscal resources to deal with this growing pressure of the market. And so I can't underscore it more that we of course talk about African urbanization as if it is a thing, but it can never be a thing because you sit with such enormous socioeconomic variation, but underpinning that is also profound cultural differentiation. So, given the complexity of all of that, obviously one was trying to produce a set of messages for policymakers. This is what we argue as the core opportunity, that there's 2 things we really, really need to get right over the next decade. And that is to focus on getting education right and the infrastructure investment agenda. And this is about driving human development indicators and, of course, fostering an inclusive economic growth. So with that in mind, we just put up a couple of high-level numbers because the point is that we really have to understand how the African urban transition is different to what happened in Latin America. It's very different to what has happened in Asia. So what's important here, the numbers are fairly common, but both urban and not yet seeing a decline in absolute numbers in rural growth. So there's a slowing down in rural growth, but of course, by 2050, the majority will reach that point by 2035. This is the most important graph that deals with the crux of the socioeconomic challenges. So this is data from McKinsey Global Institute, and what this shows, based on the data set from ILO, is that 63% of the labor force is trapped in this notion of vulnerable employment. And so this means you're working in a family business or you're in the informal economy, but the point is you've got very low and unstable incomes. Now, any citizen with a low and an unstable income cannot in a way be enrolled in a compact with the municipality to pay for services. That's the bottom line. And that's why the number is so important. Now, that 63% is down from just 65% a decade before. And why that matters is that over the decade of 2000 to 2010, the average growth rate in Africa was 5.7%. So despite that robust economic growth rate, we're not able to shift the labor market structure. And this is the profound crisis we're facing. It's back to the point that I made earlier. Now, informality is not unique to Africa, as that first bullet point shows. Sub-Saharan Africa, the share of the non-agricultural labor force, 66% is informal. But the table shows you how high those numbers are when you look at specifics. The aggregate number is a little bit misleading, and it also has a gender breakdown. As you can see, Abidjan, which I want to necessarily think of as an emerging city. This is culturally a very significant urban center in East Africa. It's got a long, deep history of urban planning, urban development, governance, and so forth. And yet, you sit with 80% of the labor force. Now, if you look at the expansion of the labor force over the next 35 years, you will see we are expected to reach 1.2 billion in 2050. And we are simply not creating the kind of jobs that can deal with that expansion. So what this shows, again, over this decade and a half of high growth, is that in Central, Eastern, Southern, and West Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, you only saw labor force growth in the services sector. Only in the services sector. This, of course, correlates to the earlier graph I showed you about the net decline in manufacturing jobs over the course of the year. So this is, it's impossible to overstate how profound this crisis of work is on the continent. And of course, it means that informal living and slum living is, in a sense, inevitable. So this is just compares Africa to the rest of the world in terms of 2005 and 2014 slum prevalence. In Africa, if you take North Africa out, which only has a 12% slum prevalence rate, in 2014 that jumps to 62%. 62% of urban dwellers live in informal slum. So the argument is that if you look at what's happening with the human settlement context, with the labor force, with the fact that Africa is an incredibly small player in the global economy, and that 55% of GDP is derived from informal economic activity, there's a form of makeshift informal urbanism that is the dominant character of urbanization in Africa that we have to absolutely confront. We simply cannot rely on traditional ways in which we think about urban transitions if we are going to engage with and into this reality. So the second half of the argument is that if that is a given, if we're going to stare these dynamics squarely in the face, we're going to confront them on their own terms, what is the kind of policy frame, given the global context, given the shifts that I referenced earlier that is happening, the debate we're going to have in Quito next week around the urban agenda, what does it mean for reframing the urban question? So at a macro level, the conceptual starting point would be to embrace the idea of sustainability, but that this notion of environmental sustainability helps us to pivot the argument towards questions of green and the sustainable economy and what that might mean. Secondly, given the high levels of poverty and income inequality, social inclusion has got to be the absolute basis of whatever development project we're talking about. And of course, from an infrastructural urban development point of view, that means access to basic services, employment, and finally, I think it's something that we don't talk about explicitly enough, is the idea of institutional competence. And here the argument is not just about decentralization or local government or the state. It is about understanding that across society, including civil society organizations and the private sector, we've got massive institutional deficits. And so we've got to build a much tighter, more compelling notion of what institutional competence is. So, of course, one can say everything is important in this kind of context. And so Goal 11 is really helpful in the argument. And so that has to be a touchpoint. But if we think through the policy implications, and again the idea here is to take this enormous complexity and if you think about an integrated agenda, this massive canvas, and see how do we narrow that down so that we can get to a set of actions that both the leadership can agree on, but also can produce action. So that's the thinking. And so the implications of this is we have to think in an integrated fashion about how does one respond to the unique endowments and challenges of different territories based on evidence and time series analysis. Now that sounds maybe trite and kind of self-obvious, but the extent to which planning in many African contexts unfold in the absence of any reference to evidence or data is shocking, right? So the government operates on the basis of force of habit. The idea of joined-up infrastructure investments, we believe, can serve as the primary catalyst to remake and grow human settlements at different scales. And we've got to fundamentally change the national paradigm of what national multi-level governance means. And so I am personally someone who's tracked and worked on discourse around decentralization for a long time. I am absolutely convinced that we've got to step out of that discourse and think of a much more dynamic, fluid, integrated understanding of differential ways of dealing with unique territorial complexities. And the discourse on decentralization as the begin and end all as a precondition for governance is just not helpful at this point. Not that it's that decentralization is not important, but that particular kind of obsession that the bank, of course, is non-incidental to, I think is problematic. And then the idea of capacity building. So this thing is the stylization of a very complicated agenda. The idea that you've got to simultaneously work at the city regional scale because of the way, of course, of environmental management's work and scarce resources, but also how does one effect systemic change over a generation or two? And how does one enroll the bulk of urban citizens in dealing themselves with some of the challenges because we don't have steady capacity? So the starting point is something that will be self-evident. So the discussion on how do we achieve circular metabolic dynamics within urban systems. So moving from linear systems where we've got inputs and outputs, and one where we can begin to return some of that within the urban system. And the argument is that if most of the urban growth is going to happen in Asia and Africa over the next 40 years, this is where we're going to have to think very carefully about how do we take the new technological possibilities and connect that with the material conditions that I just reflected on within the presentation. And so this idea of sustainable infrastructure is really at the heart of the policy agenda. By this we mean an extension of the UNDP definition of the green economy, which is about carbon, about resource efficiency, and about inclusion, and to add on the idea of spatial integration. And so spatializing debates about the green economy, we believe is really, really central to dealing with the kind of specificities on the ground that I'm talking about. So if we take the World Bank numbers about what the infrastructure deficit is, so in 2010, the World Bank released a kind of state-of-the-art definitive account of infrastructure deficits in Africa. This is data from there. It was very much still the only data that we cited, so it's pretty dated by now. But when you read that really comprehensive, insightful, carefully argued work, that assumes that we know exactly what infrastructure is about, and how to invest in and how to roll it out. Right? So the technological underpinnings of the modern engineering norm for infrastructure systems is not questioned at any point in that work. And what we argue is that actually that vision is not most of these places, the populations are so poor, the institutional capacities are so weak, and where we've seen a lot of these infrastructure systems can, in fact, exacerbate an extractive and a polluting metabolic system for our natural resources. So the argument is that if we take any infrastructural investment, we have to unpack the scale of it and its technological intensity. And we've got to confront politically and economically whether it is capital or labor intensive. So the former mayor of Johannesburg, Foxtrot, had this really compelling campaign over the last 5 years of his term of office, where they did a retrofit analysis of every single infrastructure sector in Johannesburg to understand what is a capital labor ratio. And it then created a program called Josie at Work to try and create and grow small businesses that could do more labor-intensive forms of capital, of infrastructure provision as a way of shifting what he understood as an inappropriate capital-intensive approach to infrastructure provision in Johannesburg. So it's that kind of debate that we think all cities need to confront, and not just to assume that these technological packages that gets delivered to them from the infrastructure investors or the intermediaries, that has to be taken into account. That there's a debate to be had about what the specific infrastructure approach should be. Within that, we make an argument in the paper that the three most important infrastructure priorities is energy, mobility. The belief here is that if you can connect, particularly the first three investments there, you begin to effect certain land use changes within these cities, which is the entry point for a new form of revenue generation in most of these cities. But it requires very, very careful calibration and integrated planning. And that kind of place-specific calibration is not possible unless you build regional innovation systems within these cities. What do we mean by regional innovation systems? In most African countries, we still have traditional understanding of innovation that the national department of government is the custodian of innovation. They take a traditional industrial policy view and they say automotives or textiles are the key industries for the economy, so we're going to support innovation in that way. The argument here is that that era is gone, that cities are highly sensitive to the milieux of places, and that we've got to try and think through how regional coalitions of universities, businesses, social movements, governments can begin to produce the learning and the answers to understand how you do that calibration. So this is a very different way of thinking about innovation. And it's something that tries to put metropolitan or regional governments at the center of these systems. And of course, it's got to be alive to appropriate technological innovations. And of course, in Africa, renewable energy and mobile internet is the two of what McKinsey lists as the 10 disruptive technologies that are really beginning to make the catalytic. But we need enormous amounts of work to really begin to think through what does that mean if you're serious about universal access. So one example of this is of course the incorporate business that have grown in East Africa on the back of the PESA system, and the rate of connection to microgrid solar systems through this particular platform is really, really impressive. And at the heart of it, if one has to distill, let's say, for the sake of argument, we want to call it a business model. It is really about understanding, and what I mean by people's determination is that, of course, if you've got limited state capacity to provide basic services, it is not as if people don't access services. Right? What happens is that you've got a whole raft of compensatory mechanisms that emerge to provide water, energy, and so forth. And these are not cheap, pretty social capital things. They are pretty nasty stuff, where intermediaries, private providers, are able to step into the breach and to create these ecologies of service provision. And households have to take their very, very little meager incomes and make these fine-grained calculations. Are we eating today? Are we accessing some water? Are we going to the water vendor? Are we getting food or not? So, but the point is we've got these systems that's there. And so any future system has got to figure out how do you connect a formal system with what one calls this informal adaptive system to create a hybrid service delivery model. And this is where the R&D lies. This is what we've got to figure out. What does that hybrid mean in these kinds of places? Now, on the back of social mobilization or organizations like SDI and so forth, we've seen attempts to collectivize. We've seen the importance of various forms of social structures and social capital. And we've seen now within corporate and so forth the importance that ICT can bring to this particular configuration. But what is often missing from this is an understanding of placemaking, right? What I call it the site design literacy. So to empower people with the capacity to figure out at the neighborhood scale how do they want to optimize the various resources to enhance the quality of placemaking. But to do that in a way, so if you take a microgrid, for example, that it is interoperable with, if you will, top-down investments or service delivery strategies. And this is the landscape that we still need to figure out in most of these places. The reality is that we need these regionally sensitive and specific innovation systems. The transport one, as I said, will be very familiar with you, to invert the planning frame away from the car and to take the pedestrian and non-motorized transport as the apex of your mobility system. Of course, this is very, very difficult to do because for any of you who've traveled to any African cities, you will know that we already sit with the North American physical form and traffic jams. Okay, even though car ownership is probably 10 to 15% in most places. So this is a very, very intractable, complex issue, but unquestionably is at the heart of shifting the spatial form in most of these places. ICT, I don't want to go into too much, but I think I don't know if you guys have discussed the World Bank report this year on ICT, which has some really compelling data. That graph there shows the level of the significance of the digital divide by income, by generation, rural, urban, and in terms of gender. And as you can see, of course, this is a massive, massive area of work that needs to be attended to. So I want to then just conclude by focusing on this idea of globalization. If you look at the scale of the need, you look at the way in which risk is defined by infrastructure investors, there's no way in the next generation or two that you can aggregate the finance to deal with the scale of the need. There's basically too many poor people, and most African governments are considered too high a risk to warrant financing infrastructure. That's the bottom. That's the kind of the core argument. And so what you have to do is to engage with the idea of the possibility of community-driven service delivery systems. This is the localization. And here you've got to understand how does one systematically grow the capacity of local authorities to provide services, and at the same time connect that up with more systematic community-driven methodologies and leave the two together. And obviously, both of those dimensions requires a focus on building local skills to do and to work in this particular way. And of course, within the placemaking agenda, it's not really rocket science what most households want. We have a very clear idea of what these priorities are. Again, I don't have time to go into it, but one of the effects of the kind of accelerated urbanization with the absence of infrastructure investment is that you're dealing with extremely high levels of vulnerability and systemic violence in many, many important settings. And so dealing with questions of safety and well-being is really, really fundamental. Questions of work and income, good education, vibrant and safe public spaces. And that, of course, sets the catalyst for people to reinvest in local communities. So in some ways, this is obviously a very crude stylization, but the idea is to also try and say that this is not so complicated that we don't know what to do. Right? We can build local institutions or strengthen them to work more effectively together to begin to deliver these public goods which the public sector for themselves. And here the opportunity of thinking through the next generation public goods methodology is the key catalyst. So if you take imperatives like the care economy, the non-based support, So again, in South Africa, we've had to innovate around this prevalence of HIV/AIDS. So to make sure that people take either their TB medication or their HIV medication, we've had to literally train tens of thousands of people that work as volunteers to go and check up on people in the public health system to make sure that they take the medication and that the nutritional intake is adequate for the medication to work. So there's no reason why, if you took a look at early childhood development, that you can't extend that same path. Right? So we know that why educational outcomes often poor in many African cities is that in the cognitive formative years of between the age of 3 and 6, most children have no exposure to any form of education. So why one can't create a socially embedded early childhood development system in the slums with the right kind of design. And same applies to ecosystem services in terms of green infrastructure, cultural services, protection of public infrastructure. So there's a whole raft of things that we kind of mention in the paper that can be done to begin to think very differently about how you enroll these unemployed young people into various kinds of public works that is also building the core fabric of the service delivery model that's appropriate to these kinds of projects. And again, the idea of income and work and the experience of work is absolutely central. So we come back to this graph, but the broader point is that you need dedicated institutions to do the intermediary work to bring these systems to the life. So just to kind of step back and to explain why this localization agenda is so important. At the moment, the only discussion that is going on is how do you raise the amount of money available for infrastructure investment? That's the discussion. And the point we're making is that given the reality on the ground, to only focus on the quantum is to fundamentally miss the point about the nature of the fabric of these places. And if you will, the absolute market failure that is happening on the quantum side. So you've got to build a completely different frame and different paradigm. And this is an attempt to begin to do that. Of course, you can't just focus on the local level, and this particular perspective is also in the report that UCLG will launch tomorrow on Thursday, the Gold 4 report. And this is the idea that we begin to think about the national multi-level governance system in these ways so that it can support the kind of bottom-up localization and regional transitions that I've just spoken about. So how do we aggregate spatial data so that we've got a more intelligent approach to a national infrastructure investment program? And how does that dovetail with both the national and the regional policy? And how does that translate into a symbolic program? And then finally, on the human resource implications, and this only comes back to the point we were just discussing. We made a massive breakthrough at the level of the African Union 2 years ago with the African Charter of the Values and Principles of Decentralization, Local Governance and Local Development was established, which was the first time that African governments came together and acknowledged that both urbanization and decentralization matters. We at the moment talking to different institutions, including Cities Alliance, to see how do we focus on really massive capacity building initiative, and lastly, the idea of